We actually have a conversation with Aastha and Merete, who is our author from Denmark, speaking about intersectionality and climate change and stories of nature. Thank you, Merete. Thank you, Aastha. Aastha, over to you if you could introduce yourself and the author and introduce the panel discussion topic itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Lasya. I'm Aastha. I am a writer, editor, and architect. I work on the intersections of design, culture, and feminist theory. Merete, I will let you introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Merete, and I'm a Danish writer, and I've been writing and publishing for many years. So I have written a lot. I guess today in this panel we will talk more about the natural world, how to, I wouldn't say just describe it, but incorporate it in the writing. And it is something I have worked on from quite early in my authorship. And also when we talk about feminism, to me it's, I do write a lot about women. I do have many female protagonists, but I also think, to me, that what is important to show the writing is the gender roles, how they maybe define us in a way that's limiting for everybody, men and women. That, to me, it's not so much the feminism in itself that's important. It's to understand how gender roles forms us as people, and to understand when it is good for you, when you feel, yeah, this is fine, I thrive in these roles, or when it's bad for you, when it makes your life hard, or make you feel you're not yourself, that you cannot do what you want. And I think it goes for both men and women. So what I'm interested in is trying to show these things, how societies have expectations to genders that are sometimes also very national, very culturally inhibited, that can change from one culture to another, and also how we may be able to try and be ourselves instead of being the gender we are given by birth and by society.
And I think you portray all of that so beautifully in The Beauty of the People, where the gender roles become, make some more vulnerable, some more violent, some more susceptible to tragedy, and more susceptible to also spur into action in times of crisis, right? And I think those intersections of identities and natural tragedies, or the landscape of that is social and material, becomes a very intrinsic part of the storytelling itself. And I think feminism as we know it, and its intersectionality, it does justice to that entire ethos. Especially in conversations about ecology, community, family, and individual, scaling up of things and how interconnected they are in our planetary imagination of the world today. Would you like to perhaps, I really enjoyed the way we were doing the other track where we read excerpts of that. And I honestly wouldn't mind kind of picking up pieces, just reading some of it out and just going on to discuss it from the lens of eco-literature. I think we can do that.
Yes.
So I had a suggestion for an excerpt, but it's really up to you when you'd like to do that. The place where they go to visit the Carstens, the gypsy family.
Yeah.
Perhaps later, but I just thought that we could talk about that episode or read it out a little bit later. But
so
over to you.
Talking about the fire or later?
I think the fire. Yeah, the fire.
Yeah. So yeah, it's So I would like to make a comment on that because I grew up in a family that had very many racial distinctions, and it was difficult for me because I went to school, of course, and in my school there would be children who were black or colored or different, still very few by that in that time in the 70s when I went to school. We did not have yet the great immigration waves that came later, but there were some. And if the children were colored, I was not allowed to play with them. And I had a friend in school who was colored, and I loved her very much, but I was not allowed to take her home or go home to her. And it was strange. I tried to understand it, and I didn't really understand it. And I tried to hide it from her, but it was also difficult to hide it from her. And so one of these distinctions were like, they call them, the word is not really gypsies, but it's people who are not white, but who work with coal or mining coal. So they get also colored from the coal. So it's also, that you have a very low class.
Social stature. Is it also used as a slur?
Yeah, it's really bad. It's bad. It's bad. And also the gypsies are bad. And
I know but it was highly uncomfortable to say that, but I realized it was a translation. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a translation, and it's today as a writer, I think it's important to show how deeply racism has been part of our culture, but at the same time, there are words I don't want to use.
Yes.
And it's always a balance trying, because I think it's important to show, because I don't want to make it cleaner than it was, because it was really dirty. But at the same time, there are things I don't want to repeat in my writing. So they're talking about like this family being somehow tainted. The word is also come from tainted. And then the thing is that what they say in the story is that this family, one of the girls, the grandmother, had been as a young girl to the Virgin Islands, and she had not understood what this virgin things means. And Marie, the child protagonist, she doesn't understand at all. But she comes back and she gives birth to a colored child. And the father of this girl, he accepts the child, which is really rare. Many people would like throw them out, but he accepts the child, and so he becomes the inheritor of the farm. And we have this colored person as a farmer. And so they are all really, because he's a rich farmer and he's a good farmer, and but he's colored. So
not white.
So he has a very special. Yeah, he's not white, and the father is Marie's father is dependent on him because he gives him work. So he has to be nice. And then so what they do, is they put him in a special category, like he's not a gypsy. You have to believe that, because the gypsies are not Christian, and so instead they take another category, the category of being Christian, and put that onto this farmer. So he might be colored, but he's Christian, so he's okay. So
that salvages. Yeah. That makes him purer.
Yeah. And that is how it worked. And I have lived for many years in Italy, and it was a really strange experience, because in Denmark we have racism against African people. If they're African people, they will suffer from racism. But Chinese people don't suffer as much because they work hard, and it's like they're different. So in Denmark, we don't have so much racism against Asian people, especially China. We have mostly Chinese people in Denmark. So, and then I went to Italy, and I realized it was the other way around. Because in Italy, there's a lot of racism against Chinese people. And it's like they eat, you know, they don't eat like we do. In Italy, what you eat is so important, and they don't understand how the Chinese eat, and it's difficult, and they don't like it, and they probably catch rats and eat them. You know, they have all these kinds of stories, and
the same people have different stereotypes attached to them in different locations, which obviously goes to say that it's more telling of the racist than the race itself. Exactly. And that complexity.
Whereas the Senegalese in Italy, they are treated much better because they are Catholics.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like all these different categories. And I thought it was interesting to try and describe it. And I thought it was a way I could show this deep, deep racism that lots of people they will deny it. You know, certainly. Everybody will deny it. Yeah. No, we're not.
And for the Indian audience that's listening in, I think the analogy between race and caste becomes very, very pertinent in the context of the Indian subcontinent, especially to do with occupations and which subsect of an oppressed caste becomes legible for respect and which doesn't, and how some have to hide their caste in order to live even a slightly dignified life, and so on and so forth. So I think would you like to read that? And perhaps point me to it as well.
Yeah,
I think it's okay to begin with an uncomfortable.
we start somewhere else.
A very potent.
Okay, so it says,
when Murray reaches their yard, is that where we are starting? At the time of the fire?
Yes, I start, in fact, the passage before, because that's where the mother tries to explain Marie. So she calls it slave black, you know, it's not my word. Stavesort eller ej, havde Carstens far været et hæderligt menneske, og det var Carsten også, hvilket Marie aldrig måtte glemme. Og Guds børn var slaverne jo også, det måtte man heller aldrig glemme, selvom det kunne være svært at forstå. Det var ikke som de rigtige teater. Der var nogle ukristelige røver, hvordan man end vendte og drejede det. Yeah.
Shall I? Marie was soaked to the bone by the time she reached the gypsy's yard. Her mother once explained that Mr. Carsten was a farmer, so he wasn't really a gypsy, of course. But his grandmother had lived in the Virgin Isles, and apparently she didn't understand what this meant. Marie didn't understand what it meant either, but she was loath to admit her ignorance, for Mr. Jensen punished ignorance with vengeance. But her mother said that the result of Carsten's grandmother's ignorance was the birth of a slave son on the farm. Considering how high and mighty the Carstens are, her mother said, let it be a well-deserved lesson to them all. Black as a slave or not, Carsten's father had been a decent human being, and so was Carsten for that matter, which Marie was never to forget. For also God's little children were slaves after all, something we should always bear in mind, her mother said, even if this is hard to understand at times. The Carstens weren't like real gypsies, heathen thugs, each and every one, her mother said, no matter how you looked at it.
Yeah, so there are all these distinctions. And I think that, you know, distinctions are interesting. Also, if we slide with that, because I think it's important, we have always distinctions. And if we talk about nature, when I grew up in this suburban Denmark, my parents had come from a rural area where they didn't really have a garden. There would be like a small patch of some grass, and there would be some fruit trees and some berry bushes and maybe a little tulips, and that was it. So when they, like most of Denmark, moved to the suburbs in the 70s, the idea of the perfect garden evolved. And a perfect garden needed to have a huge lawn for the children, so we could play ball. That was, I mean, we were supposed to be not working as they had worked as children. We should have carefree infancy on these lawns. They had to be so clean, so, and you would have some nice flowers and things brought from India or Nepal, like the rhododendron became very popular in Denmark. So you would bring exotic plants into your gardens to make it beautiful. And that needed a lot of poison. And it needed a lot of weeding. And I was brought up with, there was like two kinds of plants. There were the weeds and the non-weeds. And the weeds had to be exterminated. And I would receive like some coins for each of these weeds I dug up in the garden. That was my job as a child, was to dig up weeds, and then I would get some money for how many I collected. And I was not allowed to be part of the garden work because children were not orderly enough. And I had my own really small garden where there were no windows facing, so nobody could see it. And I would plant raspberries there. And they were pretty wild, and my parents detested it. But you know, I had my own little thing going on there. So, and then there were also, we had roses, and on the roses there are these lice, little lice, and they were the enemy. And we would spray them with poison. And so many years went by. I moved from home. I lived in an apartment for many years. And only a few years ago, I got my own garden. And then it's like we have the whole paradigm of the gardens has changed. And so now you want your garden, you don't want to distinguish between good and bad plants. So I think you can also compare it to that luckily some of this innate racism is melting away. Like we don't want to make these distinctions between good and bad as you did. Like you can have weed and you can have roses at the same time. And I had this garden, and I'm new, I'm not very good at it, but I understand how to do some things. And I'm part of a Facebook group called the Wild Gardens. So you want to learn. And then one day somebody wrote in that group, "Oh, hooray, the lice has come on the roses. Now there's food for the birds' children." How do you call them when birds, the little birds, the new birds. And to me, that sentence was a revolution, because suddenly I realized you didn't have to spray with poison, that these little lice that comes on the roses, they are part of the cycles, and they feed the birds, the new birds, and it's really interesting to see how the whole paradigm shifts in our way of looking at the garden. And to me, as a writer, what I'm interested in my writing, in my portrayal of characters, is what happens inside our minds. When history changes, we do change mentally. I mean, when the worldview changes, something happens inside our head, and that changes what I'm really trying to grasp in my literature is, how do we grow up in one society, and then as adults we live differently, we do different things. What is that process? And even more so, something we learned as adults and then maybe as older adults changes again. Can we make our mind do that change? Because it's not easy. Like I describe in The Beauty of the People, is also these children who grow up in a very authority-based society, they would be hit by everybody. The children, they just have to shut up and take the beatings. But when they become adults, we have the whole movement of the hippies, and we don't want authorities. And then they stand there with something inside of them, wanting authority. And maybe they agree it's better without, but it still lives inside them. And it's a conflict that every person has to understand inside yourself. And now I think we have it with the nature and the whole change also in how we use nature and how we have to stop doing certain things. And
I think this idea of controlling the elements of nature, like spraying pesticides, all of that has started to transform, at least at individual levels, right, on the garden. But I'd really love to hear from you this transition, especially with respect to your parents who came from working as farmers, living in extremely impoverished contexts, and then moving on to the suburbs, and still the knowledge, the wisdom, and the relationship with the soil and plants.
Yeah.
Transitioning from survival and food and perhaps produce and livelihood to something that becomes a luxury and aesthetic, a space for your kids to play in, that indicates that you have earned a life that is of dignity and maybe a little bit of leisure, which is a huge luxury. So, like, in all of this, how does your role how does your relationship with the soil and the plants change, and how do your parents how did they make that transition? What kind of resistance perhaps and challenges did you notice?
There's a lot of resistance. Like, I have debates with my mother, who's now very old. So my father has died. She has help in her garden. And so she has these, a hedge, you know?
I think meanwhile, I'll kind of sum up what we were doing on the other track. We were reading out excerpts from the book. And what we were covering was the first 20 pages, which is almost 1/3 of the book, talks about a fire, a tragedy that happens in one of the houses, and how the father of this family is someone who makes and builds thatched roofs and repairs them. So he almost kind of looks forward to a tragedy. But more importantly, they talk about, there is one line after the entire crisis and tragic incident of the fire has kind of ebbed that says, this tragedy was the 21st of July. The 22nd of July arrived with glorious sunshine and warmth in tow. The dog days were come. And they will end the way they began, said the father, as will all of us, said her mother. And I thought these two lines were so prolific, with so much wisdom embedded in them about this very cyclical nature of tragedy, sunshine, rain, that Merete talks about very beautifully and in different ways in her work, in what is perhaps considered eco-literature. And I would actually love for her to comment on that. I hope we get her back soon.
We are trying to contact Merete, but meanwhile, if you could, if you have any more of Merete's readings that you'd like to do read from for the audience.
Sure.
Yeah,
I can do that.
Just try to pat Merete back in. Thank you so much.
Of course. Okay, I think some of this nature reading is really beautiful. There's a lot of sensory details there, so I'm just going to read out this. Summer stole in between the green high summer leaves of the trees, tumbled over the sea, made the fishermen's boats seem like lazy ocean birds, and her mother's hands and legs swell. Mary had to scrub floors, shell peas, and gather red currants, but it was high time she pitched in around the house. This was the reason she only went to school every other day, after all. Valdemar, which is her younger brother, pumped water. Emma and Cow bellowed from their little stable on the border to the Lutzens. Kai, another brother, had started getting up early in the mornings to fish with their boys, Hardy and Bork, who was 18 now and old enough to take over Uncle Thorvald's cutter. Now he was dead and gone with Venus, gobbled up by fish in the sea. Mary learned how to clean place, for her mother's swollen fingers couldn't grip their rough and slimy bodies anymore. The rasping sound of her flensing the place filled the silence in the kitchen. Kai was sent for water for the potatoes and lay on his back in the grass. Oh, Merete is back. I was
yeah, I'm
giving
sorry,
her-
I don't know what happened.
That's okay.
I'm glad to hear you just started reading. That was
We
a good-
had the pleasure of your literature there to fill up the space.
Thank you.
I was actually just talking about these two very specific lines after the fire, right? It was the 21st of July. The 22nd of July arrived with glorious sunshine and warmth in tow. The dog days were come. And they will end the way they began, said her father, as will all of us, said her mother. And I think there's so much wisdom, nihilism, and kind of optimism in all of that entangled together, right? In those two lines, and very similar to what you were talking about as a cycle. But you did get interrupted when you were talking about the resistance of your parents moving from the farms to this. So let's go back to that.
Yeah, we have all these discussions because you shouldn't cut the hedge before it has flowered because all the bees like it. You shouldn't put poison on the roses, and we discuss it a lot. And my mother, she somehow tries to be open, and you can see where I live I live like it's by the North Sea, and there's some summer houses and there's a lot of houses, and it's like there's a war in the gardens because half of the gardens are quite wild with a lot of nettles and high grass, and others are just green lawns with a robot cutter and hardly anything, and they call them green deserts, and a lot of gravel for the car to park. And it's like two worlds clashing. And I think what is important is not to make a war, but to try to, and some of the people who have a very neat garden will go and cut down the grass in the wilder garden, and the ones with the wild garden will strew seeds and flowers into the green garden. So you try to make the other people become like you. But I think it is important that we have more diversity, and I think also that we do change. We need to change. We need to be in a different mode. We need to move less. Like, of course, right now I would wish I was in India, but still we are doing this Zoom talk and it does work, and we're saving a lot of fuel. I mean, the Corona crisis has changed some things in Denmark. A lot of people are moving to the countryside and slowing down because it has to do with slowing down also to use less resources. Yeah,
I think like this crisis has obviously reprioritized things for a lot of us, and as climate change, words like Anthropocene and eco-literature, eco-feminism become part of our daily vocabulary. It's I think I would love to kind of hear what did you set out to write with that lens? Is it just something that's embedded in your experience so much that it comes it just is a part of your storytelling, the relationship with nature and change, right? And transition, especially individual and collective and pluralistic for that matter, which I think is a really, really interesting reflection between people and the world they live in.
When I was pretty young, in my mid-20s, I wrote a book that really had to do with the whole climate change crisis, but it was very early in all this, what is happening. And it was a book that had quite an impact when it came out. And then I read a huge newspaper article on, literature dealing with the climate crisis, and my book wasn't mentioned, but what was mentioned was a lot of young male poets. And I got really, I was there 20 years ago. So what my publishing house did was they have relaunched the book. I mean, it's been reprinted and relaunched because it did, it did make an impact on the Danish ecological literature. But my vision is also always in the language. So it had a lot to do with language, and a lot of these very, very beautiful languages that are connected to nature. I mean, our description of nature, of plants and animals, it's a vocabulary that's just so rich and beautiful and intense. So,
and it's not just yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah,
I just meant that
you talk.
Sorry, there's a lag, and I always mistake. No, I was just I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that a lot of, say rural, indigenous, tribal wisdom that has the workings of nature, the respect and reverence towards nature, and a cyclical nature of it embedded in the language, wherein something like climate change, exploitation, and resource and productivity kind of become alien punctuations in all of that. They kind of disrupt that vocabulary. Perhaps that's also something that becomes a challenge when works are translated from a certain, not just language, but also ideology and context to a very colonial language like English, right? For instance, and climate change is developed in an unjust world, and it's exacerbating the vulnerabilities and inequalities experienced especially by women who perform a lot of the invisible labor and also a lot of the productivity labor, not just on the house front, but also on the farms, on the fields, and in the global south that becomes even more exacerbated. So I think these intersections are something that you deal with really well, especially when you talk about the many pitfalls of gender roles. Yes. And the responsibilities that come with it. There are a couple of questions over here that they'd like you to talk about eco-feminism within the eco-literature framework. What are the kind of conversations happening, perhaps, in what you deal with? And of course, also indigenous wisdom that we talked about, perhaps something analogous. Like over here, we have a lot of like the way the tribal communities in India, the relationship they have with the land and with their land, and not in terms of ownership, but in terms of, as a part of a cyclic, as a part of a circle that is not hierarchical. What perhaps is the analogy where you live and come from?
Yeah, so I think we could learn a lot from that. I mean, we should be the ones reading that literature, because we have a highly agriculturalized country. There's so little nature left. So we should be like a warning. We have more pigs than people. We have twice as many pigs as people in the country. And their shit is a huge problem because it's full of ammoniac. And it's like you're trying to do things, but the industrialized agriculture and animal how do you say, animal farming,
animal husbandry, really,
it's like it's clashing against each other. And I think, in my point of view, it can be, I mean, we do have a lot of people writing about eco-literature, the ecology. In my point of view, you have to be a little hard. I mean, if we consider feminism being, understanding and cyclical and using literature as something to show it can be different, I think sometimes we have to be careful, because I think we need a lot of action. We need a lot of doing things. Of course, sometimes doing is not doing, things like not traveling or not eating meat, things like that. But we have to be very strong.
This pandemic imposed inaction was a good pause for the planet in a lot of ways. And the part you said about more action and less talk reminds me of Greta's latest speech that went blah, 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 blah. And it was so excellent. More specifically, please go ahead.
I can see a question about that in India, like in tribal communities, women are known to practice a slower agriculture, a more sustainable agriculture, and how that is in Denmark. I mean, we do have a lot of ecology, but it's different because we hardly have any tribal. I mean, it's a small country. We have 5 million people, and it's very industrialized. So the tribal living, it doesn't really exist anymore. But what is happening is that a lot of people are moving out of the cities, living a slower life, growing their own vegetables, eating much less meat. Vegetarianism and veganism is growing radically. And even I eat meat sometimes, but we do eat a lot of vegetarian meals. And my niece is a vegetarian, so I cook for her and my mother, and even my old mother, for whom it's a status to eat meat. I mean, you show you are wealthy by eating meat. She's like, oh, it's okay, I can eat vegetarian. So things are changing.
People are unlearning, people apply.
And I wish I could say, oh, it's the feminist movement, but I don't think it is, because there's a lot of men involved, and I like that. I mean, it's like, I think it's important to say we need to change things, and we need to change them together. But of course, if you have more tribal societies where men and women have more different roles, it can be seen in another context. But I don't think we have that context anymore. No.
Just shifting gears a little bit here. I'm just thinking about how the presentation of climate change in its various formats, visual and literary, has taken a turn in the past few years, right? From ideas of depicting only devastation and plastic-filled oceans and turtles being strangulated, it has become a lot more coherent, a lot more impactful. When you depict the fragility of a shoreline, for instance, and its progressive receding in certain parts of cities being slowly submerged, houses going up on stilts, those very subtle, and I like, how do you deal with that? I mean, a lot of that exists in the way you write, especially when you scale up from the individual mental makeups to the larger ideas of the world and how we navigate it, coming from different contexts. How do you deal with that in your work?
Yes, I think I just, it's becoming more and more present, as everything is. Like, one thing is, I moved to the countryside and I grow my wild garden, and of course your daily life, it flows into your literature. It always does. So plants are coming up in my literature as well. And I have had some assignments. I just wrote a book for school children, where we have something called the red list. Do you have that as well? Yeah, the red list with all the threatened plants, the plants and animals that are under threat to disappear.
Yeah, have them extinction, endangered list.
Yeah, and it's language-wise, it's such a beautiful list. But it's also terrible, because these are things that we are losing. So I wrote a book based on this list, with the words, with the names from this list, and then I wove around it, like, how can you do? And it's always, when you write for a younger audience, you need to show them this is the fact, but you also need to give a way of action to say you can do this to maybe change things. And I know now, the younger generation, like the parents said, oh, we should go to Thailand for the winter holidays, and the children say, no, we won't go to Thailand. We can go like 50 kilometers in our electric car if you want to move from here. So a lot of things is happening from the young people, and I think it's we must not forget to write about the climate change for the younger generation, and in my view, to write them in a way that they can be aware of what is happening, but also that they can be given some means of action,
tools to act.
to act. So that's
absolutely, because it's a very real problem for the younger generation, right? And while individualism, the way we've been living for so long, comes up short on good ideas and certainly a sense of purpose and joy, it is, I think, in the idea of a community that holds incredible wisdom, right? I mean, I think we need to come to this as whole human beings, and that means the uncertainty, the grief, the rage, the anxiety, but also a lot of ferocious love for each other and the futures, right? I think if any last comments, Merete, I think we can wrap it up, right?
Because as a writer, I'm always interested in people, what happens inside of us, and I'm so, what I notice now is how pragmatic people are. Like they say, oh, we have the climate change. Now we can start growing wine in Denmark. It's a cold country, never had wine. People are starting planting vineyards in Denmark. So it's very pragmatic. And also I bought this house in the countryside, and my husband said, he looked at all the paperwork on the house and he said, oh, it's good. We are 12 meters above sea level, so we should be safe. And I'm like, 12 meters? Okay. So it's like, we instead of just trying to stop the climate change, we already are ahead in our heads saying, how can we deal with it? What can we do in our individual lives to live with these changes?
And how tall stilts can be built to stay above everyone else, and doesn't matter how many drown.
Maybe it's also how humans always have survived. It's like we see possibilities in everything, and it can be extremely scary because we might disappear as a kind. But maybe, we will just start building, live on boats or whatever.
As Catherine Wilkinson, who wrote the book on climate change, the anthology, says that we can't solve this problem with our prefrontal cortex alone, right? We have to consider core approaches to climate leadership, and compassion, connection, creativity, care and nurturing, and a deep commitment to equitable justice is something that has to intersect across genders, nationalities, identities.
If I can say something in my sense, I have a lot of, I think the European countries, the Western countries, we are so set in our ways. My hope is so much in a country like India, because the times I have been in India, what I see is a lot of capacity to change, a lot of capacity to find new ways, to maybe
adjust. That's what they call it.
That takes us a long time. So I hope you will be the leading the leading role in all this.
I mean, perhaps I as an individual hold a slightly more cynical approach towards my country, but it's nice to see that, of course, it could be promising. There's one question, perhaps we can just address that quickly. Jyotsna says, do you write about the relationship between Denmark's colonial past and its impact, say, with respect to Ghana, plantations, slave trade, spice trade with Calcutta, or China, or more contemporarily regarding Greenland, with respect to agriculture, land, the whole evolution? Is it taught in Danish schools? Is it part of the histories talk about in Denmark? And yeah, I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah. So it's a huge question. It's taught very little. I mean, it is taught, and it's maybe getting a little better, but still, I have been connected to Greenland quite a lot through some friends. I have Greenlandic friends, and I have been there several times. And I have been there, how do you say, not working. I mean, I haven't, because Danish people go to Greenland to work. And I have been there in a little different position because I came as a friend of somebody. And so what I notice is like Danish people will always say, it's impossible to learn Greenlandic. It's the most difficult language on earth. We cannot learn it. We need to make the Greenlandic people Danish. And that's what's been done. But nowadays, a lot of people are coming from especially China and Thailand to Greenland, and they have not been taught that Greenlandic is a difficult language. So they just learn it and use it. And the Greenlandic people are very happy because suddenly they have foreigners who learn their language and use it. And it just shows, how colonialism is inside our heads and inside how we behave and what we think about, like something about language. And I think,
and the rejection of a language is an excellent tool for colonization. Yeah.
And I think Greenland is one of the most colonized places on earth still. And when I was there last, there was a lot of people, official people in a little town I went to, people from Denmark coming on official business. And I know some of them, some from the big cultural funds. And I have always seen them the men only wearing a suit and a tie and very formal people. And I didn't recognize them first because when they go to Greenland, they are wearing like outdoor gear, because when we go to Greenland, this is where we, the Danish people,
let loose. Yeah,
we let loose, and we are in the wilderness, even though it's not, the city's not in the wilderness, but we feel like we're in the wilderness, and we dress differently. And this is our
neocolonialism. Yeah.
So it is really, I would say it's really neocolonialism. So, but I'm faced, I mean, the friends I have who are Greenlandic are writers and artists. And I honestly believe that saying these things, if I come and say, oh, this is what I see, I do the same once again, I become the Danish person who will say how it really is in Greenland. And I think it's much more interesting to listen to the Greenlandic writers and artists themselves. But I think that 20 years ago, I wouldn't have thought like that. I would just have written something about Greenland. But now I do hold myself back because I think maybe it's not my say. Maybe I should just go 2 steps back and listen instead.
With that, I think we are ready to wrap up, if that's okay. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. Everybody. Yeah.
It's been such a pleasure, Merete. Let's stay in touch.
Thank you so much. Yes, I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Merete and Aastha. It was lovely hearing you two and hearing Merite's work as well. We had a delightful conversation touching upon really important themes, discussing eco-feminism, eco-literature, and also colonialism at the end of it. Really wonderful listening to both of you.
Thank you so much, Muda. Thank you, Aastha. Thank you, Merete. And I would also like to thank the Embassy of Denmark for bringing Merete to us. It was an absolute delight having this conversation with you and also discovering that there's so much in common between India and Denmark and all the conversations that you were having. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks, Aastha. Thanks, Merete.